The decision to move to Oak Ridge Estates was not one we made lightly. After researching school districts for months, I found that Westlake County offered the most comprehensive programs for students with disabilities like my daughter Emma. At 12 years old, Emma has cerebral palsy that affects her mobility but not her bright mind or determined spirit. Her previous school had limited resources, and I watched her potential being stifled day by day despite her remarkable intelligence and creativity. Our modest savings allowed us to purchase one of the smaller homes in Oak Ridge Estates. It stretched our budget to the breaking point, but I would have sold everything I owned to give Emma the education she deserved. The house itself needed some work, nothing major, just cosmetic updates to bring it into line with the immaculately maintained neighboring properties. But it had the essentials: wide doorways for her wheelchair, a layout that could accommodate a ramp, and most importantly, an address within the Westlake School District boundaries. The day we moved in, several neighbors stopped by with welcome baskets and friendly smiles. Mrs. Henderson from across the street brought homemade cookies and offered to show Emma where the children in the neighborhood gathered to play. The Patels next door helped unload some of the heavier furniture and insisted we join them for dinner that weekend. For the first time in years, I felt a cautious optimism blooming inside me. Perhaps here, finally, we could build the stable, supportive life Emma needed. Our first weekend, I noticed a thick envelope in our mailbox, the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowner Association welcome packet. Inside was a binder nearly 2 inches thick filled with bylaws, regulations, and community standards. I flipped through it briefly, noting rules about lawn maintenance, approved paint colors, and restrictions on visible recreational equipment. Nothing seemed unreasonable, though the sheer volume of regulations was somewhat intimidating. A glossy newsletter was tucked inside the front cover, featuring a photo of the HOA board. The woman in the center, identified as President Patricia Wilkins, had a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Emma started physical therapy at the local clinic immediately. Her therapist mentioned that several children with mobility issues attended Westlake Middle School and spoke highly of their accessibility accommodations. When I inquired about transportation, she assured me that the district provided specialized busing for students with disabilities. The transportation department confirmed this when I called, explaining that the bus had a hydraulic lift and secure anchoring system for wheelchairs. They would pick Emma up right at our front door. That night, Emma and I sat on our new back porch, watching fireflies emerge in the meticulously landscaped yards around us. She seemed more relaxed than I had seen her in months, excited about starting at her new school in 2 weeks. "Do you think the kids will like me?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. "They will love you," I assured her, gently squeezing her hand. "Just be yourself." As the summer evenings ticked by, we settled into a routine. I unpacked boxes during the day while Emma explored our new neighborhood in her motorized wheelchair, making tentative friendships with a few children her age. The parents I met were cordial if somewhat reserved. One mother mentioned in passing that the HOA ran a tight ship, but that it kept property values high and the community prestigious. I nodded politely, not yet understanding the warning beneath her casual remark. The morning of Emma's first day at Westlake Middle School arrived with perfect late summer weather. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom window as I helped her dress in the new outfit she had carefully selected the night before, a purple blouse that matched the frame of her wheelchair and comfortable dark pants that accommodated her leg braces. I braided her hair the way she liked it, with colorful beads at the ends that clicked softly when she moved her head. "Are you nervous?" I asked, adjusting her backpack so it hung properly from the handles of her chair. "A little," Emma admitted, "but mostly excited. The science teacher has a real skeleton in her classroom." I smiled at her enthusiasm while mentally reviewing our morning checklist. Extra medication in the front pocket of her backpack. Emergency contact information laminated and tucked into her binder. A small communication device clipped to her chair in case she needed assistance during the day. Everything was prepared, down to the last detail. The transportation department had informed us that the bus would arrive at approximately 7:30. At 7:15, we positioned ourselves near our front window, watching for the yellow vehicle that would mark the beginning of this new chapter. Emma fidgeted with anticipation, periodically checking the time on her watch. At precisely 7:30, we spotted the bus turning into our neighborhood. I felt a surge of gratitude at their punctuality, routine, and reliability were so important for Emma's sense of security. I opened our front door and began guiding Emma's wheelchair down the ramp we had installed over the front steps. The morning air felt fresh and full of possibility. But then something strange happened. The bus stopped at the entrance to our cul-de-sac, rather than proceeding toward our house as expected. Through the windshield, I could see the driver gesturing to someone standing beside the vehicle. I squinted against the morning light, trying to make sense of the delay. "Why are they stopping there?" Emma asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "I am not sure, sweetheart. Let me go check." I jogged down our driveway toward the bus, leaving Emma waiting near our mailbox. As I approached, I could hear a woman's voice, sharp and authoritative. "Our HOA bylaws clearly state that commercial vehicles are not permitted within Oak Ridge Estates," she was saying to the confused-looking bus driver. "This includes school buses. The children can meet the bus at the main entrance." I recognized her immediately from the newsletter photo, Patricia Wilkins, HOA president. In person, she was immaculately put together in a crisp white blouse and tailored pants, her highlighted blonde hair arranged in an expensive-looking bob. A clipboard was clutched in her manicured hands. "Excuse me," I said, slightly out of breath from my jog. "There must be a misunderstanding. My daughter Emma has cerebral palsy. She cannot walk to the entrance of the neighborhood. The school arranged for door-to-door pickup specifically because of her disability." Patricia turned to me, her expression cool and dismissive. "I am sorry about your daughter's condition, but rules exist for a reason. Large vehicles damage our private roads and detract from the aesthetic of our community." The bus driver, a kind-faced older man, looked apologetically in my direction. "I was just told this is my route, ma'am. I need to pick up your daughter and 2 other students with special needs in this neighborhood." "I understand that," Patricia cut in before I could respond. "But they will need to meet you at the main road. We have had this policy for years." I felt heat rising to my face. "That is impossible for Emma. She uses a wheelchair. The distance to the entrance is nearly half a mile." "That sounds like a personal issue, not an HOA issue," Patricia replied, making a note on her clipboard. "Perhaps you should consider a different living arrangement if this community does not meet your needs." I looked back toward our house, where Emma sat watching us, confusion evident even from this distance. The other neighbors who were outside preparing for their day had stopped to observe the confrontation, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "This is discriminatory," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "The Americans with Disabilities Act guarantees reasonable accommodations for transportation." Patricia smiled thinly. "The ADA applies to public spaces and services. Oak Ridge Estates is a private community with privately maintained roads. Our bylaws were reviewed by our attorney." The bus driver checked his watch nervously. "I hate to rush this conversation, but I have other students to pick up. What should I do about your daughter today?" I closed my eyes briefly, calculating our options. Emma could not miss her first day. I would have to drive her, but our car was not equipped with the proper anchoring system for her wheelchair. I would need to carry her. "We will make other arrangements," I said finally, defeat evident in my voice. I walked back to Emma, her expectant face falling as I approached without the bus. I explained as gently as I could that we would need to find another way to school today. Then, in full view of our watching neighbors, I lifted my growing daughter from her wheelchair, carried her awkwardly past the smug-looking Patricia, and settled her into our car parked on the street. I folded her wheelchair, struggling to fit it into our small trunk before returning for her backpack and supplies. The humiliation burned in my chest as I drove Emma to school, her silence more devastating than tears would have been. That afternoon, I would need to leave work early to pick her up, an accommodation my boss would not be pleased about. But as I navigated the morning traffic, it was not logistics that occupied my thoughts. It was the look of satisfaction on Patricia Wilkins' face as she watched us struggle. It was the helplessness I felt in that moment. And it was the absolute certainty that this could not stand. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed emotionally exhausted from her first day, I sat at our kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee and the massive HOA rulebook. The house was quiet except for the occasional turning of pages as I methodically examined every bylaw, every regulation, and every amendment. My eyes grew tired, but my determination never wavered. If Patricia Wilkins wanted to play by the rules, I needed to know exactly what those rules actually said. 3 hours and 2 cups of coffee later, I had my first breakthrough. Nowhere in the entire document was there a specific prohibition against school buses entering the neighborhood. There were regulations about commercial vehicles. Certainly, no overnight parking of work trucks, no vehicles with extensive company advertising, no vehicles over a certain weight limit parked on the streets. But nothing that would prevent a school bus from briefly entering to pick up students, and absolutely nothing specifically addressing school district transportation for students with disabilities. I created a spreadsheet documenting every transportation-related rule I could find, noting page numbers and exact wording. If Patricia was interpreting these rules to ban school buses, she was doing so selectively and without textual support. This was personal policy disguised as official regulation, a crucial distinction. The next morning, I called the transportation department at the school district, explaining our situation in careful detail. The administrator listened sympathetically before sighing deeply. "Unfortunately, we have encountered this issue with Oak Ridge before," she admitted. "The previous transportation director tried to negotiate with them, but eventually gave up. We have been picking up special needs students at the entrance for the past 3 years." "Has anyone ever challenged this from a legal perspective?" I asked. "Not that I am aware of. Most families either comply or move elsewhere. I am sorry, but our hands are tied unless something changes officially with the HOA." This information was discouraging but useful. It confirmed that Patricia had been enforcing this unwritten policy for some time. It also suggested that no one had seriously pushed back against it. Yet, that weekend, I decided to sound out our neighbors. The Patels invited us for a backyard barbecue, and several other families joined. While the children played on a modified swing set that Mr. Patel had thoughtfully adapted for Emma, I carefully steered conversations toward the HOA. "Oh, Patricia runs this place like her personal kingdom," Mrs. Henderson confided when I mentioned our bus situation. "Last year, she fined the Jacksons $500 because their holiday decorations included blue lights instead of the approved white ones. She made the Morgans tear out their vegetable garden," another neighbor added. claimed it was unsightly agriculture, not permitted in the landscaping guidelines, even though it was in their backyard and barely visible from the street. "Why does everyone allow it?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. Mr. Patel lowered his voice. "Most of the board members are her friends. They rubber stamp whatever she wants, and people are afraid of getting on her bad side. The fines can add up quickly." "Has anyone ever run against her?" "The Thompsons tried 2 years ago," Mrs. Henderson said. "Suddenly they were getting violation notices weekly. Their grass was a quarter-inch too long. Their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Their children's bicycles were visible from the street. They eventually sold their house and moved." This pattern was troubling, but offered insight into how Patricia maintained control. I carefully avoided mentioning my position on the school board. That information would be more valuable if kept private for now. During the week that followed, I set up a temporary solution for Emma. A sympathetic neighbor with a wheelchair-accessible van offered to drive her to the bus stop each morning, where I would meet them before going to work. It was a complicated arrangement that required both of us to leave earlier than necessary, but it preserved Emma's dignity better than being carried. Still, I saw how the situation wore on her. The strain of being treated differently, yet again, in a life already filled with unnecessary obstacles. In the evenings, I researched accessibility laws with growing interest. The ADA had specific provisions regarding transportation for students with disabilities. While Patricia might be technically correct that private roads gave the HOA some discretion, federal laws protecting disabled individuals often superseded local rules when reasonable accommodations were at stake. I printed several relevant legal cases and guidelines, highlighting key passages for future reference. Most significantly, I discovered that denying Emma direct bus access might constitute a violation of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which mandated appropriate transportation as part of a disabled student's educational rights. According to her IEP, Individualized Education Program, door-to-door transportation was specified as a necessary accommodation due to her mobility limitations. Armed with this knowledge, I made copies of all relevant documents and organized them methodically in a binder. The HOA might have its rulebook, but I was creating one of my own, one grounded in federal law rather than arbitrary preference. The final piece of intelligence came unexpectedly during a brief encounter with Patricia herself. I was collecting mail when she approached with a violation notice about our recycling bin being visible from the street. "We take community standards very seriously here," she informed me with practiced authority. "By the way, I noticed you work at the school district." "Yes," I replied neutrally, accepting the notice. "In administration." "Well, perhaps you can explain to your colleagues why buses cannot enter Oak Ridge. It would save everyone time." Her dismissive tone made it clear she had no idea of my actual position. She assumed I was a secretary or assistant, not someone with authority or influence. This unconscious underestimation might prove useful in the confrontation to come. That night I made my decision. No more accommodating unreasonable demands. No more temporary workarounds. It was time for a direct approach backed by facts, law, and principle. The next morning, I contacted the HOA secretary and requested a spot on the agenda for the upcoming board meeting. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Clubhouse was an imposing colonial-style building with gleaming white columns and manicured hedges. Inside, the meeting room was arranged with precision rows of chairs facing a raised platform, where the HOA board members sat behind a long table, name placards positioned exactly equidistant from each other. Patricia Wilkins occupied the center seat naturally, her posture rigidly perfect as residents filed in and took their seats. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in professional attire, my binder of research tucked under my arm. Several neighbors nodded in recognition as I selected a chair in the front row. The Patels gave me encouraging smiles from across the room. I had practiced my presentation repeatedly, timing myself to ensure I stayed within the 5 minutes allotted to each resident concern. My heart pounded steadily against my ribs, but my hands remained calm as I reviewed my notes one final time. The meeting began with standard procedural matters: approval of previous minutes, treasurer's report, updates on landscaping contracts. I listened attentively, noting how Patricia controlled the flow of discussion, subtly cutting off comments that diverged from her preferred narrative. The other board members deferred to her automatically, rarely offering independent opinions. Finally, the agenda reached resident concerns and requests. Two people spoke before me, one about a disputed fence line, another requesting permission for additional holiday decorations. Both received non-committal responses promising committee review. Then Patricia called my name, consulting her list with a slight frown as if trying to place me. "Thank you for the opportunity to address the board," I began, standing and moving to the small podium positioned for resident use. "I am here to request a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act for my daughter Emma, who has cerebral palsy." I outlined our situation clearly and concisely. Emma's disability prevented her from walking to the neighborhood entrance. The school district provided specialized transportation for students with disabilities. The bus needed to access our home directly as specified in her educational plan. I explained that I had thoroughly reviewed the HOA bylaws and found no explicit prohibition against school buses entering the neighborhood for pickup and drop-off purposes. Federal law requires reasonable accommodations for persons with disabilities, I continued, my voice steady. Allowing the school bus to travel to our home for approximately 2 minutes each morning and afternoon constitutes such a reasonable accommodation with minimal impact on the community. I distributed copies of the relevant legal guidelines to each board member, noting how Patricia barely glanced at hers before setting it aside. When I finished my prepared statement, the room fell silent. Several residents nodded in apparent agreement with my position. Patricia cleared her throat. "Thank you for your thorough presentation. However, I must remind everyone that Oak Ridge Estates operates under specific guidelines designed to maintain our community standards and property values." She gestured toward the large windows overlooking the neighborhood. "Our restrictions on commercial vehicles, including buses, exist for good reason. They prevent road damage, reduce traffic, and maintain the residential character that attracted all of us to this community. But there is no specific prohibition against school buses in the written bylaws," I pointed out. "The prohibition against commercial vehicles is understood to include all large vehicles not belonging to residents," she countered smoothly. "If we make an exception for one situation, others will demand similar treatment. Soon we would have delivery trucks, maintenance vehicles, and all manner of commercial traffic disturbing our peaceful community." "A school bus is hardly comparable to commercial traffic," I responded, "and the ADA specifically addresses the need for reasonable accommodations that may require exceptions to general rules." A male board member, Thomas, according to his nameplate, spoke up. "While we sympathize with your situation, changing our vehicle policy could potentially impact property values. Studies show that excessive traffic correlates with decreased home prices in premium neighborhoods." "We are talking about one bus for a few minutes, twice a day," I clarified, frustration beginning to color my tone despite my best efforts. "The precedent is what concerns us," another board member added, not quite meeting my eyes. "Once we start making exceptions, where does it end?" The discussion continued for several more minutes, but I could see the outcome taking shape before the vote was called. Patricia had framed the issue as one of property values versus personal convenience, deliberately sidestepping the legal and ethical dimensions of disability accommodation. The other board members, whether from genuine agreement or reluctance to challenge her authority, adopted her perspective. When the formal vote came, it was 4-1 against my request, with only Mrs. Garcia, a newer board member, supporting the accommodation. Patricia announced the result with practiced regret, offering empty platitudes about community standards benefiting everyone in the long run. "We encourage you to continue using the current arrangement of meeting the bus at the neighborhood entrance," she concluded. "Many families make similar sacrifices for the privilege of living in Oak Ridge Estates." I thanked the board for their time with a politeness I did not feel, gathered my materials, and walked steadily from the room. Only when I reached my car in the parking lot did I allow my composed expression to falter. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, processing not just the denial but the dismissive attitude behind it. This defeat was infuriating but not unexpected. In fact, it was necessary, a documented rejection of a reasonable accommodation request that would strengthen what came next. As I started my car, a plan was already forming in my mind, one that would leverage resources Patricia Wilkins clearly did not know I possessed. The conference room at the Westlake County School District Administrative Building had a different atmosphere entirely from the HOA clubhouse. Here, the lighting was warmer, the furnishings chosen for function rather than show. Around the oval table sat 9 individuals from diverse backgrounds, each selected by their communities to oversee educational policy for thousands of students. As Director of Special Education Policy on the school board, a position I had held for nearly 3 years, I was respected for my expertise and advocacy. Today's meeting followed our standard agenda, covering budget allocations, curriculum updates, and facility improvements. I participated actively in each discussion, focusing intently on the matters at hand rather than the personal issue weighing on my mind. Patience and timing were critical to my strategy. When we reached new business near the end of the session, I raised my hand. Superintendent Garcia nodded in my direction. "I would like to bring attention to a potential issue regarding transportation compliance for students with disabilities," I began, my tone measured and professional. "It has come to my attention that some students with mobility impairments may not be receiving appropriate transportation accommodations as required by their IEPs and federal law." I deliberately avoided mentioning my personal connection to the situation, presenting it instead as a general policy concern that had emerged through my regular oversight responsibilities. "Could you elaborate?" asked Dr. Martin, our legal counsel who specialized in educational policy. "Certainly. I have reason to believe that some students with documented transportation needs are being forced to meet buses at neighborhood entrances rather than receiving door-to-door service as specified in their educational plans. This appears to be due to HOA restrictions in certain communities." The statement produced immediate reactions around the table. Dr. Martin frowned deeply, while the transportation director, Mrs. Abernathy, began flipping through notes on her tablet. "This would constitute a potential violation of IDEA requirements," Dr. Martin noted. The district is obligated to provide transportation specified in an IEP regardless of local homeowner association rules. Mrs. Abernathy looked up from her device. We do have several students in HOAs who meet buses at community entrances. I was told these arrangements were made with family agreement due to HOA restrictions. Were these agreements documented as acceptable alternatives in the students' IEPs? I asked, knowing the likely answer. I would need to verify, but I do not believe so, she admitted. It was handled as an informal accommodation to community rules. Informal accommodations that potentially violate federal law place the district at significant risk, Dr. Martin interjected. If challenged legally, we would have difficulty defending such arrangements. Board President Wilson leaned forward. How many students might be affected by this issue? Based on preliminary research, potentially 7 to 10 students across 3 private communities, I replied, having done my homework thoroughly. The most restrictive appears to be Oak Ridge Estates, where 3 students with documented mobility impairments are currently being denied door-to-door service. The discussion expanded as other board members asked questions or offered perspectives. Several expressed concern about potential liability, while others focused on the students' rights and educational access. Throughout, I maintained my professional demeanor, presenting facts and legal considerations rather than emotional appeals. I propose we conduct a formal review of all transportation arrangements for students with disabilities, I suggested after the initial discussion had run its course. Any discrepancies between IEP requirements and actual service should be identified and rectified immediately. I second that motion, said Mrs. Washington, another longtime advocate for special education services. We cannot allow anyone to interfere with appropriate accommodations for our most vulnerable students. The vote was unanimous in favor of the review. Furthermore, the board authorized Dr. Martin to draft formal communications to any homeowners associations currently implementing required transportation services, informing them of the district's legal obligations and the primacy of federal law over private community regulations. Should we encounter continued resistance, Dr. Martin suggested, we may need to consider legal action to ensure compliance. The precedents in this area strongly favor educational access over private restrictions. As the meeting concluded, Superintendent Garcia approached me. Would you be willing to participate in any necessary discussions with these HOAs? Your expertise in both special education law and policy would be valuable. I would be happy to, I replied, maintaining my professional composure despite the satisfaction I felt at this perfect opportunity. Perhaps we should start with Oak Ridge Estates, as they seem to have the most restrictive policies. Excellent. My assistant will coordinate schedules for a meeting next week. We will invite their HOA board, our transportation director, and Dr. Martin to ensure all relevant parties are represented. Later that afternoon, in the privacy of my office, I finally allowed myself a small smile of anticipation. The wheels were now in motion through proper channels, with full institutional backing. My position had transformed from that of a pleading parent to an authorized representative of the school district with legal authority and resources behind me. I made one final call to Dr. Martin to discuss strategy for the upcoming meeting. Should I disclose that I am personally affected by this issue? I asked. There is no ethical requirement to do so, he advised after consideration. You have approached this as a policy matter affecting multiple students, which it genuinely is. Your personal connection does not invalidate the legitimate legal concerns. That evening, I helped Emma with her science homework, watching as she meticulously labeled parts of a cell. Despite the daily challenges of meeting the bus at the neighborhood entrance, her resilience never ceased to amaze me. She deserved better than arbitrary barriers imposed by someone who valued property aesthetics over basic dignity and inclusion. "Is everything okay, Mom?" she asked, noticing my thoughtful expression. "You seem distracted." "Everything is fine," I assured her. "I am just thinking about a problem at work that might be solving itself soon." The meeting with Oak Ridge Estates was scheduled for the following Wednesday. I marked it on my calendar and began methodically preparing documentation, not as a frustrated parent this time, but as a school board director upholding federal law and educational rights. Patricia Wilkins had no idea what was coming. The district administration building's main conference room was prepared with meticulous attention to detail for the meeting with Oak Ridge Estates HOA representatives. Legal documents and transportation guidelines were arranged at each place setting. A projection screen displayed the IDEA requirements regarding transportation for students with disabilities. Water pitchers and glasses had been positioned precisely, lending an air of formal significance to the proceedings. I arrived 30 minutes early, reviewing notes with Superintendent Garcia and Dr. Martin. Mrs. Abernathy from Transportation joined us shortly after, carrying detailed route maps and student IEP transportation requirements with all identifying information redacted for privacy. "Remember, we are approaching this as a matter of legal compliance, not confrontation," the superintendent advised. "Our goal is cooperation, not conflict." I nodded agreement while organizing my materials. My heart rate had increased slightly, but years of board presentations and advocacy work provided a framework of professionalism to contain my personal investment in the outcome. At precisely 2 o'clock, the receptionist escorted the Oak Ridge Estates representatives into the conference room. Patricia Wilkins led the group, dressed impeccably in a navy business suit, her expression confident and somewhat dismissive. Behind her followed 3 other HOA board members, including Thomas and Mrs. Garcia, who had cast the sole vote in my favor at the previous meeting. None of them showed any particular reaction to seeing me seated with the district officials. They clearly assumed I was there in my professional capacity, unconnected to the matter at hand. "Thank you for making time to meet with us today," Superintendent Garcia began after introductions were complete. "We have asked you here to discuss an important matter regarding school bus access within Oak Ridge Estates." Patricia straightened imperceptibly. "We have been very clear about our community's transportation policies. Our roads are privately maintained, and our bylaws restrict commercial vehicle access." "We understand your position," the superintendent replied evenly. "However, there are federal requirements that supersede local HOA regulations in specific circumstances. Dr. Martin will explain the legal framework we are operating within." Our legal counsel outlined the relevant provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, emphasizing the district's non-negotiable obligation to provide appropriate transportation as specified in student IEPs. "In practical terms," Mrs. Abernathy added, "this means door-to-door service for students whose disabilities prevent them from safely traveling to a central pickup location." Throughout these explanations, I observed Patricia's expression shifting subtly from confidence to annoyance. The other board members appeared increasingly uncomfortable, exchanging glances as the legal ramifications became clear. "While we respect your community guidelines," Dr. Martin continued, "the law is unambiguous in this area. Educational access for students with disabilities takes precedence over private community restrictions when those restrictions effectively prevent appropriate accommodations. Patricia leaned forward. Our concern is with precedent and property values. If we allow one exception, others will follow. Soon our roads will be filled with commercial traffic of all kinds. This is not about commercial traffic, I interjected, speaking for the first time. This is about fundamental educational access for children with disabilities who legally reside in your community. Patricia turned toward me with a flash of irritation. And you are involved in this matter how, exactly? The moment had arrived naturally, without needing to be manufactured. I met her gaze directly. I serve as the Director of Special Education Policy for this school board, I replied calmly. And I am also the parent of Emma, one of the students currently being denied appropriate transportation accommodations in Oak Ridge Estates. The effect was immediate and profound. Patricia's eyes widened in genuine shock, her carefully constructed poise faltering visibly. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly understanding the full context of the situation. You never mentioned your position during our HOA meeting, Patricia said accusingly. It was not relevant to my request as a resident and parent, I replied. That request should have been evaluated on its legal and ethical merits, not on who was making it. The superintendent smoothly redirected the conversation. The personal connection is coincidental to our purpose today. The district has identified several students within Oak Ridge Estates who require door-to-door transportation according to their legally binding educational plans. We are obligated to provide this service, regardless of HOA restrictions. Dr. Martin slid a document across the table, a formal legal notice outlining the district's position. This letter details the specific federal statutes that apply in this situation. It also explains the potential consequences of continued noncompliance, which could include legal action by the district or affected families. Thomas, who had voted against my request at the HOA meeting, cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should reconsider our position, if federal law requires these accommodations. Our attorney reviewed our bylaws, Patricia insisted, though with noticeably less conviction. He assured us our restrictions were legally sound. Your attorney was not considering the intersection of private regulations with federal disability law, Dr. Martin countered. This is a specialized area where general property law is superseded by civil rights statutes. Mrs. Garcia, who had supported my original request, spoke up. I believe we should allow the necessary accommodation. It affects very few students, occurs briefly twice a day, and appears to be legally required. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes, with Patricia gradually finding herself isolated as her fellow board members recognized the untenable nature of their position. The superintendent and Dr. Martin remained firm but professional, emphasizing cooperation rather than conflict while making the legal requirements unmistakably clear. Finally, seeing no viable alternative, Patricia conceded with poor grace. We will permit the school buses to enter Oak Ridge Estates for the specific purpose of transporting students with documented disabilities, under protest, and without admitting any liability for past restrictions. That is acceptable, the superintendent confirmed. Mrs. Abernathy will coordinate with your board to ensure minimal disruption while meeting our legal obligations to these students. As the meeting concluded and documents were signed formalizing the agreement, Patricia avoided my gaze entirely. The other HOA board members appeared relieved that the matter had been resolved without escalating to formal legal proceedings, though the tension remained palpable. When the Oak Ridge representatives had departed, Superintendent Garcia turned to me with a small smile. "Well handled. You maintained remarkable professionalism throughout." "Thank you," I replied, gathering my materials. This was never about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that Emma and children like her receive the accommodations they are legally entitled to. Yet as I walked to my car afterward, I could not entirely suppress a feeling of satisfaction. The system had worked as intended. The law had been upheld, and Patricia Wilkins had discovered that power wielded arbitrarily eventually encounters proper authority grounded in justice and principle. The morning air carried the fresh scent of fall as Emma and I waited in our driveway 1 week later. Her wheelchair was positioned perfectly, her backpack secured to the handles, her expression a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. We had explained that the bus would be coming directly to our house today, but after weeks of difficulty, she remained skeptical. "Are you sure it is coming here?" she asked, checking her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. "Positive," I assured her. "The transportation department confirmed everything yesterday." We heard it before we saw it, the distinctive rumble of the school bus turning onto our street. Then the yellow vehicle appeared, moving slowly past our neighbors' homes until it stopped directly in front of our driveway. The mechanical whir of the accessibility lift deploying broke the morning quiet. The driver, Mr. Jenkins, stepped out with a broad smile. "Good morning, Emma. Door-to-door service as promised." Emma's face lit up with a smile that made the entire struggle worthwhile. Mr. Jenkins operated the lift with practiced efficiency, securing her wheelchair with the proper restraints once she was aboard. Several neighbors had emerged from their homes to witness this small but significant victory, offering supportive waves and smiles. Mrs. Henderson called from her garden. About time they did the right thing. As the bus pulled away with Emma safely aboard, I noticed Patricia Wilkins watching from her front porch across the street, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Our eyes met briefly before she turned and went inside, the door closing with unnecessary force behind her. Her displeasure was evident but also irrelevant. The law had spoken, and even HOA presidents were not above it. That evening, Emma bubbled with excitement about how much easier her day had been. "I was not exhausted before class even started," she explained. "And guess what? Lily from the next street over was on the bus too. She has diabetes and sometimes has trouble walking long distances. We are going to be science lab partners." The following week brought unexpected developments. Several neighbors stopped by to express their support, many admitting they had long found Patricia's strict enforcement problematic, but had been afraid to challenge her. The Patels hosted a small celebration dinner for us, where conversation inevitably turned to other HOA issues that perhaps deserved reconsideration. "The playground equipment restrictions are ridiculous," Mrs. Jenkins said. "My grandson cannot use the community park because the accessible swing was denied for aesthetic inconsistency. And the garden restrictions prevent many of us from growing cultural foods important to our families," Mr. Patel added. "All because Patricia claims vegetables are unsightly." What had begun as one family's struggle for accessible transportation was catalyzing a broader conversation about inclusion, reasonableness, and the true purpose of community guidelines. People shared stories of arbitrary enforcement and intimidation that had gone unchallenged for years. A month after the bus began its regular stops at our home, notices appeared announcing the upcoming HOA board elections. Traditionally, these had been perfunctory affairs with the same board members running unopposed year after year. This time, however, 6 new candidates stepped forward, including Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Patel. Their platform centered on reasonable rules reasonably applied, a direct challenge to Patricia's rigid approach. When the votes were tallied at the November meeting, Patricia retained her seat by a mere 3 votes, but found herself surrounded by 4 new board members committed to reform. The balance of power had fundamentally shifted. The first meeting of the new board approved several significant changes. The vehicle restrictions were formally amended to explicitly permit school buses and medical transport. The architectural review process was revised to prioritize accessibility accommodations. A new community garden space was designated behind the clubhouse. Patricia attended these meetings with diminishing enthusiasm, her influence waning with each unanimous vote against her position. By spring, she had stopped coming altogether, sending a brief email announcing her resignation due to personal commitments. The remaining board elected Mrs. Garcia as the new president, the same woman who had cast the sole vote supporting Emma's bus access months earlier. One afternoon in April, Emma and I sat on our front porch, watching neighborhood children play freely on our street. The atmosphere in Oak Ridge Estates had transformed subtly but meaningfully. Gardens bloomed with diverse plants. Children with various abilities played together on updated equipment at the community park. The school bus made its stops without controversy. "You know what I learned from all this, Mom?" Emma asked thoughtfully. "Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it is scary." "That is true," I agreed. "But it is also important to stand up the right way with facts, persistence, and dignity. And a little bit of secret power helps too," she added with a grin, referencing what had become our private joke about the big reveal meeting. As the school year drew to a close, Oak Ridge Estates prepared for its annual community picnic. The theme, suggested by the new Community Inclusion Committee, was celebrating our differences. Tables were arranged to accommodate wheelchairs. Allergen-free food options were clearly labeled. ASL interpreters were available for several deaf residents. I watched Emma join a group of friends, her wheelchair moving easily across the newly paved pathways installed by the HOA. The sight filled me with quiet satisfaction. This had never been about winning a personal battle against Patricia Wilkins. It had been about creating a community where differences were accommodated rather than penalized, where rules served people rather than the other way around. Sometimes, standing up for what is right ripples outward in ways you cannot anticipate. One bus, one accommodation, one principled stand had transformed an entire neighborhood's understanding of what community truly means. As I gazed across the gathering of neighbors now engaging with each other with new appreciation and respect, I knew that Patricia's unwitting gift had been forcing us to remember that rules without compassion are merely control, and that true community is measured not by property values, but by how it treats its most vulnerable members.